thank you very much for the two previous presentations. I hope you don't mind, I'm going to talk using a tie mic because I'm quite short, if you hadn't noticed, and I think I might disappear behind the lectern if I stay there, so I'll talk from here. There's a number of topics brought up in the preceding talk of great interest, and over the last day and a bit, I've learnt a lot more about the IIC nations and the higher education sector of IIC nations. Some of the presentations and the talks we've had, in some ways, have been a little bit downbeat because of the focus on rankings and so on, and where the higher education sector is at in the IIC at present. So I think I'd like to start with a story which is a bit more upbeat about a transformation that has happened. And my focus is very much going to be on research output, so that's our expertise at Nature. So I'm going to be talking about research output in particular. So the agenda for today, I'm going to be looking at trends in outputs of scientific papers in emerging nations. Then I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the low global visibility of non-Western institutions and how that can have an influence on development of such institutions, in particular higher education institutions, of course. Then I'll talk a little bit more about Nature Publishing Group's initiatives that are relevant to promoting research output and visibility. And if I've got time, I'll talk a little bit about Nature Education, which is another initiative we're doing, which is of relevance to this group. So let's start with that positive story I want to talk to you about. China is the story of research in the 21st century. And at the turn of the century, the output of research papers from China was at the same level, approximately the same level as Russia, approximately the same level as my home country, Australia, which is a very, very small nation in comparison to somewhere like China. So China has a very big population, like the IIC has a very big population. And at that stage, back in 2000, it was had an output at a relatively, on a global scale, relatively low level for its population. Since that time, it has been through a huge transformation, and it is now on a trajectory whereby, in terms of research output, numbers of scientific papers in internationally recognised journals listed in ISI, Thomson Reuters, that it will outstrip the USA, which is of course the leader, very, very soon. So I think that's a great inspirational story for the members of the IIC. Let's just move on to looking at the members of the IIC and where they're at, and how there are also some members within the IIC that have already made great strides in terms of their research output. And so this is a summary of annual research output from the most prolific Middle Eastern IIC nations. And as you'll see, in a similar sort of time period to the last graph I showed you, Turkey and Iran in particular have hugely increased their output in international journals. So they're making great strides. And I think if we actually extended this a little bit further, you would see that Saudi Arabia also has increased a lot just in the last few years, the last couple of years. So there's some great positive stories about the way the IIC is starting to move itself into an internationally competitive position. Here are some stats from some of the less prolific Middle Eastern IIC nations. Again, you see some at a much lower scale. You see some increases here in the UAE, for example, and some of the other nations that are also laudable. So if you want to get some more details on any other IIC nation that I haven't covered here, there's a Royal Society report that's at this web address that summarises statistics like this for the whole of the IIC. So that's, if you want to look at your particular nation, you can go there. So the focus of this session is very much on quality, and so the figures I've just been highlighting to you are very much focused on output in international journals. However, what matters what's also very important is that the research output at a very high level, at the very top, in the very top ranked journals. And so, for those of you not familiar with Nature, so I'll just give you a little bit of background about Nature. Nature was founded in 1869. It's the world's #1 scientific journal. In addition to Nature, we now have many other nature journals. The characteristics of those journals tend to be that they cover a very broad area. So we have nature chemistry, nature physics, nature biotechnologies, nature medicine, and so on. And they tend to be, so they're multidisciplinary, very broad, and they tend to be the #1 primary research journals in those fields. So as a measure of high quality research output, nature journals are a reasonable surrogate for that sort of research measure. And so this graph just summarises output of papers in nature journals from some Asia-Pacific nations, just to illustrate how some of these nations are doing. So Japan clearly leads in the Asia-Pacific region, but again China, in addition to increasing its overall volume of papers in international journals, is also increasing at the very upper end of its research output as well. And so it's recently outstripped Australia again. Australia, my home nation, being put into the shade by the Chinese development, and it will certainly outstrip Japan in due course. I have no doubts. So this is some more specific statistics I'd like to share with you. This is quite important. These are taken directly from the Nature databases. And what I've looked at is papers submitted and accepted to nature journals from OIC nations. And this covers a period from January 2006 to November 2011. And so this is based on corresponding author. Now that's a very important distinction, because a corresponding author, if you're a corresponding author on a paper, that almost certainly means you have either led the research or you have been the substantive contributor to that research. So a corresponding author is a very good indication that the research is essentially being driven from that nation. So this is a summary of the statistics of submissions to nature journals from corresponding authors. So I think it's quite clear that we have a major problem here in the OIC in terms of submission to these very high quality journals. So we have 1,658 submissions over that period. Unfortunately, we've only had 9 papers from the whole of the OIC nations accepted in that period of time. So that means that in terms of an acceptance rate to nature journals, we're at 0.5%. So in other words, 99.5% of the submissions from OIC nations to nature journals were rejected in that time. So there's a clear disconnect here between an understanding of what the researchers having an understanding of what is required to get into these journals. Now I should highlight, of course, that rejection rates at nature journals are extremely high anyway. At Nature, for example, we reject over 90% of manuscripts, and all of our journals are over 80%, usually about 85%. So but nonetheless, this is still a level which is lower than you would expect. So this is just the same group of data, just divided along a different way. So this is divided into the different major journals here in the different fields, and I've just highlighted Nature Genetics and Nature because those are the 2 publications where there were actually 2 manuscripts accepted from OIC nations, whereas the other ones either 0 or 1. So this is actually looking at a different set of data. So this is looking at papers published in nature journals with at least 1 co-author from an OIC nation. So this is not the corresponding author, just all we're looking at here is whether there is 1 co-author from an OIC nation. And so over that 2006 to 2011 period, you'll see that there is some good news about the way in which the OIC is starting to change itself. And you can see that at the beginning of that period, the total for all OIC member nations was around about 25 papers being published in nature journals. By 2011, remember we're not at the end of 2011 yet, we've essentially doubled that. So in the last, particularly in the last three years, this input has really started to increase, and I think it really does reflect some of the investment that's going in, particularly in Saudi Arabia. I think if you look at Saudi Arabia, these are all the top nations in that group. Saudi Arabia was around about 2 or 1 Nature Journal papers in that time. We're now up to 12 in 2011. Again, it's not the end of 2011 yet. So that's you know, an impressive change in that short period of time. So another way of looking at quality in terms of your research output is to look at how many citations the papers gather, because citations, of course, indicate that other people are reading your papers, think they're important enough to cite in their own work. So this is just an example of an analysis from Thomson Reuters, which looks at Egyptian science as one particular example, and looks at dividing it into all these different subject areas, because citation rates do vary a lot between different subject areas for a number of reasons I won't discuss here. As you can see, Egypt does okay in terms of comparison with the global average in a field like mathematics and engineering, but as we look at some of if we go down this graph, you'll see that in a lot of areas the number of citations gathered by Egypt's papers are way below the global average in terms of the papers in those fields. And this is a pattern that is reasonably consistent in OIC nations. So that's the first topic that I wanted to cover with you. I'll move on now to the second topic, which is looking at the low visibility of non-Western institutions. So why should OIC nations care about their visibility globally? Well, these days, our higher education sectors, our institution, you're in a global competition. You're competing for, your brand is out there. You're competing for students, you're competing for research funds, you're competing for collaborations. You're competing at many, many different levels. So if you're not visible out there, if you're not getting your message out as an institution or a nation, then you're going to struggle in comparison to other institutions and nations. So these figures are based on a survey we did of scientists registered on nature.com, which is our website, which is one of the most visited science websites on the internet. And so this looked at, this asked questions of a global audience of scientists. Which of the following have you heard of? So, and we looked at a whole heap of different